Hey everyone! Today I want to talk about history's most famous ocean liner, the RMS Titanic. We all know the story. Titanic, the largest ship in the world, hits an iceberg while on its maiden voyage and sinks to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, in what is the most well-known maritime tragedy of all time. The story of Titanic is a tragedy, and both the victims and the survivors of the disaster should always be honored and remembered. But if you saw the title of this video, then you already know that's not what we're talking about today. Today, we're answering the question, who was the biggest jerk the night the Titanic sank? Were any of the passengers misbehaving and acting like little deviants? Short answer, no. But if you're like me, you probably wondered, what if I was on the Titanic? Would I be among the survivors? What would I do? I like to think of myself as a good little monster, but if push came to shove, there's no guarantee I wouldn't get a bit creative with my attempts to survive the night. You better believe I would be pacing up and down the starboard side of the ship, hoping I could be one of the lucky gentlemen Murdoch allowed on a lifeboat. That's right, Titanic fans, I did my homework. I know which side to be on. During a disaster, emotions run high, and it's difficult to say how I would react to that situation. Which makes me wonder, did anyone else make some poor decisions that night? Spoiler alert, yes! And if so, who do I think was the biggest hooligan? These are the stories of the controversial actions taken by some of the victims the night the Titanic sank. Don't forget to hit that like button, and should I say dive into this? Let's just start the video. The most infamous Titanic villain is a man by the name of Bruce Ismay. For those of you who don't know who he is, Ismay was the head of the White Star Line, the company behind Titanic. If you watch the James Cameron movie, he's that guy who keeps telling the captain to go faster. As far as villains go, Ismay is low-hanging fruit, which actually works great for me since I'm short and have small arms. That said, Ismay's actions have greatly been exaggerated. He didn't recklessly pressure Captain Smith to go faster. He didn't force the shipbuilders at Harland Wood to remove lifeboats so he could make more room for deck space. And he certainly didn't sneak his way onto a lifeboat by taking the spot of a woman or a small child. I mean, think about it. Have you ever seen someone try to cut in line? People talk. Trust me, if that was the case, it would have come up during the inquiry. No one testified that Ismay stole a seat in order to get onto the lifeboat. That said, Ismay did make some poor choices both before and after the disaster. For starters, that mustache. Not everyone can pull off that handlebar look, and I must say, the man does look pretty sharp. But if you're trying to not play the whole corporate villain angle, a whimsical mustache isn't going to help your case. All joking aside, Ismay really didn't do himself any favors. Starting with his actions following the tragedy when the survivors of the Titanic were rescued by the passenger ship, the RMS Carpathia. The captain of the Carpathia made the decision to limit all outgoing transmissions to personal messages and limit all contact with the media, only relaying to them a list of survivors. Despite this, after sending messages to the White Star Line's offices in New York to inform them of the disaster, Ismay sent a telegram requesting a ship be ready to take himself and the Titanic's crew home immediately upon landing in New York in order to avoid public scrutiny. But wait a second, that doesn't say Ismay. This telegram was sent by someone named Yamsey. Who researched this thing? Nick Pan? After the tragedy, Ismay would have received the bulk of the blame for the disaster, and the way that the White Star Line handled the events that followed the tragedy certainly helped to push that narrative. Despite that, several accounts from survivors portray Ismay in a better light, with some even saying that they saw Ismay helping women and children into lifeboats while still in his bed slippers. In fact, one of Titanic's surviving senior officers testified that he witnessed Ismay in distress while aboard the Carpathia. He described Ismay as not being in a mental state or condition to decide anything, and that he was repeating to himself, "I ought to have gone down with the ship. I ought to have gone down with the ship." In my opinion, these are not the actions of a selfish person. Ismay was a passenger that night, and his actions show a man put into a tough spot and trying to do the right thing. So I really don't think calling Ismay a villain is fair. But what about that guy? Who, me? Yeah, look at you, sitting next to that esteemed gentleman with that fantastic mustache. How'd you get on the lifeboat? For those of you wondering, sitting next to Bruce Ismay was a man by the name of William Carter. Carter isn't as well known as Ismay, but I think he might have been the inspiration behind Cal Hockley in the James Cameron movie. They share a lot of similarities. Both men were in their 30s, both were set to inherit wealth from their fathers who happened to be metal barons, and both men made it onto a lifeboat under suspicious circumstances. In the final moments of the sinking, a group of people began to rush one of the few remaining lifeboats. The purser in charge of that lifeboat fired his pistol into the air and maintained the order of women and children first. Despite this, two men would board that lifeboat, Bruce Ismay and William Carter. Now, I just finished exonerating Ismay for climbing into a lifeboat, so what made Carter's situation different? The story goes that Carter said goodbye to his wife and son as they boarded lifeboat number 4. Then he proceeded to assist other people into lifeboats until a brawl broke out around collapsible lifeboat C. Following this, he and Ismay assisted more women and children into the lifeboats until there was no one left to board the vessel. Only after running up and down the deck shouting, "Are there any more women and children? Are there any more women and children?" and receiving no answers, did he and Ismay reluctantly board lifeboat number C and escape the Titanic. But here's the problem. The lifeboat his family escaped from was lifeboat number 4, and according to my Titanic guidebook, On a Sea of Glass, hashtag not sponsored, lifeboat number 4 launched from the ship's port side at 1:50 a.m. The lifeboat Carter left on was collapsible lifeboat C, and it left the Titanic at 2 a.m. from the starboard side of the ship. This means that in 10 minutes, Carter said goodbye to his family, made it onto the other side of the ship, had time to assist others into getting into lifeboats, ran up and down the deck looking for women and children to help them escape, and somehow made it back in time to reluctantly take an empty seat. If you think this sounds unlikely, you're not alone. Carter would later receive scrutiny from the press after making it to New York, with some even suggesting that he and Ismay snuck their way onto a lifeboat, and others claiming he never saw his family off, instead abandoning them by climbing onto a lifeboat with no knowledge of whether or not his wife and his son made it off the ship. However, I don't think that's fair. Several witnesses even said that they saw Carter waiting on the deck hoping to see his wife and son's boat arrive. This suggests that Carter not only knew his wife and family was on one of the boats, he actually knew exactly which boat they would be arriving on. And about that time frame, well, it's possible some of the timing is off. The launch time likely isn't the moment he said goodbye to his family, but more importantly, the situation around the evacuation wasn't how you might think. While there was indeed some chaos in the final hours of the sinking, several of the passengers actually refused to board the lifeboats and remained inside the sinking ship. Why on earth would they do that? Are they crazy? Not at all. You have to understand the situation these women were in. Imagine yourself in the 1900s. You're inside this warm ship with all the lights on, and someone is telling you to go outside in the freezing cold and get into a small wooden boat in the middle of the night and take your chances in the middle of the Atlantic. It's also important to note that depending on your vantage point, you might not have even noticed the ship was sinking. But let's say you did. Would you board a lifeboat then? Many of you are probably sitting there shaking your heads yes. That's because you have hindsight. But also, understand that for a lot of these women, everything they owned was on that ship. Most of them were not able to work, and their only means of survival came from their husbands, whom they were being asked to leave behind. It was an incredibly difficult choice, and we shouldn't be surprised by how many of them decided to stay and spend their final moments with their family. Whoa, Napkin! Way to bring down the mood. I'm sorry, but I think it's important to understand the difficult choices the victims of this tragedy had to make. When Carter was on the ship's deck searching for women and children to board the lifeboat, we shouldn't assume that there were crowds of people begging to leave. Nor should we assume that he and Ismay stepped over the other passengers to save themselves. Again, it goes back to what I said about cutting in line. People talk, and if 2 men took a seat from a woman or child in order to save their own skin, it would have been an issue. There were about 40 other people on that lifeboat, men and women. If either of these 2 men stole a seat, we would know about it. Now, before I move on, I wouldn't be doing this video justice if I didn't mention the other thing William Carter is famous for. His hot rod. This car was made famous in the James Cameron movie and was used as a sauna by the fictional characters Jack and Rose. While the real vehicle was likely sent over in parts, it is true that there was a 1912 Renault Coupe on board the Titanic, and it belonged to this man, William Carter. Anyways, getting back on track. There's no question that Carter and Ismay made some questionable choices the night of the sinking. However, I don't think either of them acted maliciously or engaged in any criminal behavior. I mean, it's not like they kidnapped someone. Which brings us to our next topic. The man who kidnapped 2 children and brought them aboard the Titanic, Michel Navratil. Michel was... Wait, are you kidding me? It's another villain stash! Come on, people, you're making this too easy for me. Oh, I see. Villain stashes were a trend back then. That makes sense. Moving on. Michel Navratil was a French tailor in the early 1900s. During this time, he would marry a woman by the name of Marcella, and together they would have 2 children. But unfortunately, this was a volatile time for the French economy, and Michel's success as a tailor wouldn't last. I don't know all the details, but there were some affair accusations, and long story short, the couple split in 1912, with the mother gaining custody of both children, allowing them to see their father on weekends. This is a typical arrangement for families in this situation, but Michel had the idea to throw his own twist on this arrangement. What if, and hear me out, he took his kids, without their mother's knowledge, boarded the largest ship in the world under a fake name, changed the name of the children, and sailed all the way to America. It's brilliant and so well thought out. While aboard Titanic, Michel watched his 2 boys like a hawk, only allowing one other passenger to watch his two children so he could play cards. Conveniently, the woman who watched them also only spoke French and couldn't alert the ship's crew if the children made any mention of their mother. When Titanic hit the iceberg, Michel brought his kids on deck and attempted to book their passage on a lifeboat as soon as possible. But here's where things don't add up. These kids were young, both 4 and 2. Those early lifeboats were filled with mostly women and children. So I ask you, which lifeboat do you think the two kids made it on? Maybe they boarded one halfway through the evacuation? Or perhaps at the end of the night when the rockets had stopped firing? One of Titanic's last living survivors, Eva Hart, made it onto lifeboat number 14 midway through the evacuation. So I think maybe his kids might have also evacuated around that time as well. Wait, what? They left on the last boat? How? Did they save the final lifeboat for kids or something? Not at all. In fact, most of the people on collapsible lifeboat D were adults, and many of them were males. This makes me wonder if maybe their father struggled to part ways with his two children and perhaps put his life above theirs. When the time finally came to say goodbye, Michel told his two sons that he loved both them and their mother and stated that he had hoped that their mother would join them in America so that they could all start a new life together and be a family again. Aw, that's sweet. But maybe, just maybe, if you want to start over and be a family again, you shouldn't kidnap 2 young kids and take them away from their mother. Now, here's where my opinion changes. It's important to remember that these are all real people, flaws and all. Michel lost his life, and while he did make some poor decisions, in the end, he did save his kids. In fact, while researching this video, I came across some statements his eldest son made later in life about his experience on the Titanic. I found his statements warm, and it was fascinating to see how at such a young age he saw the events that unfolded that night, saying the ship was splendid and that he was thrilled to be there. He even said, "I don't remember being afraid." He even described the experience of boarding a lifeboat the same way a kid might describe getting onto an amusement park ride, going plop onto the seat and referring to the experience as a pleasure. Man, this is a tough one. While Michel is easy to vilify, and he might have made some poor choices, I don't think he was a jerk while aboard the Titanic. As poor as his actions might have been, he did do the right thing in the end. So then, who was the biggest jerk the night the Titanic sank? Was it Captain Smith who failed to reduce speeds even though they were headed into a known ice field? Was it Lighthauler who interpreted the orders of women and children first as women and children only and sent several lifeboats far below capacity? Or was it that one officer who left the gangway door open during the evacuation, causing the ship to sink even faster? Who do we need to grab our fire and pitchforks for? There's only one answer to this. The iceberg. That sucker came out of nowhere. Hiding under the disguise of a false horizon on a moonless night? That's some shady stuff, yo. Who does that? I bet the iceberg didn't even have insurance. Speaking of insurance, did you know the Titanic was underinsured? That kind of takes away from the whole theory that the Titanic and the Olympic were switched as part of a huge insurance scam. The history of crossing the Atlantic is full of interesting tales, but unfortunately, we're out of time. So I guess we'll have to leave the story of the other great ocean liners for another video. Until then, I want to thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to my channel, and don't forget to bring snacks.